Welcome to the Gita in Action podcast. My name's Radha Priti, and I am here with a family of seekers. We are studying the Gita, trying to apply its principles to our lives in an attempt to upgrade our lives and strengthen our spiritual connection. So we're here every Monday, Thursday. We do this. We read a few verses. We talk about its relevance to our lives. And hopefully we're all transformed. I know I'm transformed. So thank you all for coming live, being here today. This is an austerity. We're going to talk about that today. This is an austerity to come, wake up in the morning, come to class, pay attention, think about the things that you're learning, try to apply them. But it's an austerity that you will get so much benefit from, so much benefit from. And hopefully most of you are feeling that because you keep coming back. So let's get into it today. We are at chapter 4, text 10. And, we'll just get straight into it today. So let me share my screen. Katie, do you want to read text 10 for us?
Yes, thank you. All right. Being freed from attachment, fear, and anger, being fully absorbed in me and taking refuge in me, many persons in the past became purified by knowledge of me, and thus they all attained transcendental love for me.
Okay. Very nice. So he's again saying, as he said before, that these principles, this is not a new notion that he's just come up with, right? It's a time-honored path. And he's outlining the components of the path here, right? He's saying, how does one get liberated from the cycle of birth and death? Well, if you know God's pastimes, then your mind will become sheltered in him. That's what this transcendental knowledge is. Transcendental knowledge is the title of chapter 4. It's not just knowing that we're souls and we're not our material bodies. That's super important. But it's actually knowing God, right? That's a transcendental knowledge. And by understanding God, we become further purified and attain love for him. It's so beautiful. It's like, how many of us here have been in love before? You've been in love before, where the love fills your mind constantly, right? When you're in love, you think about the person all the time. You don't have to force yourself to remember them because it just happens because your heart's attached. So the same thing is happening here when we develop this transcendental knowledge. God becomes the constant focus of our mind, right? And then that's the goal. And then what happens? What happens after that when you fall in love, right? After you get through the stage of like you're constantly thinking of the person, the love starts to change your behavior for the better, right? Like when you're in love, you become more patient and selfless and kind, right? Because you just want to serve the person that you love. And this is the same thing, when with real transcendental knowledge of the Supreme, it makes a person less selfish, more humble, and more devoted. And it's even joyful, right? It's even joyful sacrificing our time, our money, our, pretty much everything we have. You don't see it as a burden when you're in love. You just happily do it. Right? And this is what we want to aspire for in relationship with Krishna. Right? And there is some difference. Material love, it's limited. It can fade, it can disappoint, it can be temporary. But love for Krishna, bhakti yoga, it's eternal and it's ever increasing. Like the more we love him, the more he reveals himself through us through this transcendental knowledge. It's like beautiful. It's like a risk-free investment. If you're kind of like afraid to get in a relationship and be vulnerable and okay, I got the relationship for you because you cannot get hurt. Right? It's just like it doesn't get disappointing. It doesn't fade out. You're not going to get divorced. As long as you show up and you put the work in, you'll feel that reciprocation. And it's beautiful, right? And the other thing that happens, which is what this verse is saying, is when we take shelter of him, we become free from these unhealthy attitudes toward the world, right? It purifies us. So this verse is saying attachment, fear, and anger, right? Attachment, that desire, when the ego clings on to control, to people, to outcomes. right? And then when we do that, when we cling on to these things, then there's a fear that comes up like, what if I lose it? Right? I'm so attached. What if I lose it? And then we become fearful, these things, this can be people, um, oh, let me admit somebody. This can be people or even like fear of failure or rejection, right? Or things that we have, right? And then what happens after that is anger, right? Why didn't I get it? Or why did I lose it? This is when the ego feels threatened or things don't happen our way, right? So these are the things that kind of occupy our mind and cover our soul when we're without this connection, when our connection with the supreme isn't strong enough, when we're not in love enough, right? And it consumes us. We can't think about God, right? And it covers us. So these three things are unhealthy ways of looking at the world. And to the extent that we can be free from them, we can be focused on God and we can be sheltered by God. Right? So if we use our life to develop this transcendental knowledge, all of these material attachments will dissipate. So it's like full circle, right? It's like the solution to these things is develop love for God. And then as we develop love for God, these things will dissipate. And so it just keeps compounding on itself. And many of us that have been here for a while practicing these things, we've experienced this, right? We come with a pretty heavy degree of these coverings. And we see that the more that we engage in these practices, the more that we strengthen our relationship with God, the more that our love meter, starts to rise, the more that these things kind of lessen their grip on us, or the less that these things, I guess, lessen their grip on us, right? And we're not so bound by them. And it's beautiful like that. Then you put in more, then your faith increases. You put in more. And it just keeps going like that. Right. But as we just said, as I just said at the beginning, to love and to be transformed is an austerity, right? It's not easy. It's a discipline, just like a marriage is a discipline. It takes work. You have to show up no matter, if you had a rough night or you're sick, like I've been sick this week, which has been unfortunate. It's like you still have to put in the work. You still have to show up. You still have to engage in the practices. It's work. It's an austerity of knowledge. But if you do it, there'll be purification. And from that purification being that dissipating of the attachment, fear, and anger, from that will be born a beautiful little seed of devotion, right? It's like we have to mow this, we have to what do they call that when you're like turning over the soil? And so that our bhakti seed can sprout because it's all gunked up with all of that stuff, with all that attachment, that fear, and that anger. So knowing means understanding that God is the ultimate reality and directing our love towards God and taking ourselves away from other things. Right? So if we try to understand Krishna, we try to understand that he's the center of the universe. And we realize how often we try to make ourselves the center of the universe. And this is exhausting, right? When we're so tied to our ego, right? And being free from our ego, it's difficult, but we'll realize it's so energizing, right? Like it's a burden that we all carry around, but we act like it's some kind of treasure, but really it's just a burden, right? And when we realize that it's actually a burden and we can cast it aside, life becomes so much easier and lighter. Right? Like, I don't know how many of you have been to Vrindavan, a holy city in India, but one of the things we do when we go to holy cities is parikram. We walk around the outside of the city. We do like a parikram walk around the outside of the city. And the meditation is God in the center, God in the center. And sometimes you'll even walk around the parikram, but you'll do dandavats. You'll bow down, you'll put your whole body on the ground, this dirty ground, and then you'll stand up, you'll take a step forward, and you'll do the same thing all the way around. And it's so humbling because it's like when your meditation on this is that God is the center, because what you're doing is taking yourself out of the center, and it feels really good. Um, it's like liberating, you know. So we talk about this ego a lot. We talk about ego. We know ego is a false identification with the body and the mind, And ultimately, it blocks us from God, right? But I wanted to address a little bit. Ego isn't always necessarily a bad thing, right? A little bit of ego is necessary for like survival and self-identity, right? Like it helps us navigate the world. Like, we wouldn't know how to protect ourselves or take care of ourselves or set boundaries or recognize danger, right? It's important for survival, right? And it also helps us create a sense of individuality, right? It helps us differentiate between me and not me, right? Like my baby is almost three and she or 3 months old, and she's just learning the difference in faces. You know, she can recognize my face. She's starting to figure out that her and I are different. And that's important for her development, you know? And it's also important for us to have a personal identity, you know, like our unique preferences and skills and experiences. It's healthy for us where we are. You know, if you're a liberated soul and you're fully surrendered to God, okay. But if you're, you know, a struggling Sadhaka, then we're going to have some of these kind of preferences and skills and that are unique to us. Right? Like the Gita said in the last chapter, you know, it tells us it's better to follow our own dharma imperfectly than to perform another's perfectly. You know, and implying that we need to figure out what our unique purpose is and follow that. Right? The problem with the ego is if it becomes too much, we become arrogant or stubborn or fearful or attached. But if it can also be too little. I fall into this category sometimes. It could be too little where we lack confidence or we have a lot of self-doubt. We're too passive. You know, we don't have strong enough boundaries. Our sense of self just isn't strong enough, right? And the goal is to have a strong sense of self while also knowing that we're not the ultimate controller, right? Like in Gita 247, when Krishna says, you have a right to perform your duty, but not to control the results, right? So use the ego for effort and growth, but don't let it trap you in pride or fear, right? So when it controls us, it becomes a major obstacle to this growth, peace, and relationships. So this isn't so much the focus of this verse, the ego, but because the ego is such an integral part of this verse, I wanted to just kind of address it a little bit and just go over some ways that we know when we're acting out of the ego, right? Because we know that the ego keeps us when we see ourselves in the center, God's not in the center, period. Right. And these ways we're going to just go through a list of a few things that we know when we're acting out of ego. And these should be like your check engine light when you're driving your vehicle down the road towards transcendence, right? We're all trying to get to that spiritual consciousness. And you see these things go off. This should be like a check engine light. Stop, get out of the car. What's wrong? Reconfigure, you know, fix it and keep driving because they're going to keep you from getting to your ultimate goal. And we have to perform this maintenance regularly, daily, weekly, monthly, right? If we want to get that vehicle to the ultimate goal, right? So we know we're acting out of ego if we feel offended easily, right? If somebody criticizes or disagrees with you, we get defensive or we feel hurt, right? The ego, it makes us take things personally, even if they're not meant to be that way, right? And we know we're acting out of the ego when we always want to be right. Right? Like, do you ever argue just to prove a point, even if it doesn't matter? Even if it's like, this doesn't even matter anymore. Why are we still fighting about this? It's your ego, right? Your ego value is being right over being wise, leading to unnecessary conflicts. If you're wise, you'll know when it's important to speak up and when it's not, and you'll be able to let things go because you're not so attached to your ego. But if you're not, you're going to insert yourself in everything just to prove that you're right. Right? If we struggle to apologize or admit mistakes, ego, red flashing, like flashing light, right? Your car's breaking down. Pull over, check it out. Right? If we compare ourselves to others, you get on Instagram and you're automatically feeling bad about yourself. Ego, right? It thrives on comparison. But real confidence comes from within, right? It comes from knowing that connection, that relationship with God. That's what we really need to foster, to cultivate. Not from, you know, looking like the next great thing on Instagram or making all the money that this person makes or excuse me. You know, you're acting out of ego when we feel the need to control situations or people, right? Are we anxious when things don't go our way? The ego craves control, right? Or last one, when we attach our worth to achievements or status. Anyone ever done that one? Right? Like if a failure makes you feel like less of a person, that's ego attaching. That's ego attaching your identity to external success. True self-worth isn't dependent on titles, money, or recognition, right? We need to get that. We need to get that. We don't. Our whole society is based on that, right? But if a failure makes you feel like less of a person, flashing a red light. So a balanced ego is confident, but not arrogant, right? I believe in myself, but I'm open to learning from others, right? Not I know better than everyone else, right? A balanced ego sets goals, but is detached from the results, right? I work hard and I do my best, not I must succeed or I'm a failure. And it is a healthy ego stands up for themselves, but stays humble, right? I deserve respect, but I also respect others, right? Not I must always win arguments and prove that I'm right. A healthy ego recognizes our strengths, but doesn't seek validation for them. You know, so we can say, I'm good at this. But then I also, I'm good at this and I want to use my skills to help others, right? Not, I'm going to use my skills so I can get validation and feel valuable. We can serve others without feeling superior, right? Like the attitude of I can help, but I'm not above anyone, right? Not I serve others, I do good things so that I'm better than others. Right? That's just, it's an unhealthy ego. It's a flashing red light. And it's not attractive too, right? Like if you have friends or, you know, people that you're dating that are like this, it's like, that's not attractive, right? It's funny how it's just so backwards. We think these things are like what keeps us together, but really it's not. So a healthy ego, it gives confidence but allows humility. It drives ambition but lets go of control. And it protects self-worth but doesn't seek superiority. Okay, so putting these concepts together, you know, some practical examples. Like in the workplace, if someone disagrees with you, instead of getting angry, you know, stop and take a minute and say, you know, is my reaction coming from ego? Because if we can accept, if we can implement this, if we can accept that God is the controller and we're here as his servants, right? And we're really grounded in that relationship, then the way that we'll start to view our workplace is that we're just here to do our duty, do our dharma, and then we have to detach from the results. And so in that, we just do our best to communicate clearly and compassionately, you know, the way that God would want us to his children. And then we accept whatever happens, right? We're not attached to the results because we're not making it mean something about us. We know that we're not actually the center and that God is the center. God is the controller and we're his servants. So we just have to try our best and we detach, right? How liberating is it when we can actually do that at work? This is one of the first principles that I implemented from the Gita in my life. And it was so like, totally changed my work life. Like, just to, I remember like being in the middle of an email, you know, I got kind of like like a nasty email from somebody who's just difficult to work with. And the first thing I wanted to do was just like rip them apart, tell them why I'm right, they're wrong. You know, I remember being in the middle of it and being like, why am I doing this? What's the point? You know, is this really going to like make me feel better? And then I ended up, you know, saying something nice back. And then what ended up happening is that they were actually right and I was wrong. And I was like, thank God I didn't make even more of a fool out of myself, you know? So it's like, if we could practice this, if we could really get into the mindset that this relationship with God is the most important thing in our lives, right? And we know that God is a controller. We're just as servants, and therefore even our work life is dovetailed towards that. You know, we do our service, we do our work so that we can maintain ourselves and our family, and so that we can worship God together. You know, if that's the point of our lives, everything just becomes much easier. No, we don't have to defend our ego. We don't have to prove that I'm the center. It's the same thing in relationships, right? And instead of fearing rejection or like feeling unlovable, you know, focus on that genuine connection over control, right? Again, if we know that we're by nature part and parcel of God, and we seek connection and relationship to serve God, then the relationships that we'll seek with people will be to support that relationship, right? We'll seek authentic and sincere connections from like-minded people to inspire us in that relationship, right? If that relationship is the center of our lives. We're not looking for a romantic relationship or like a friendship. We're not looking for something to fuel our ego. Right? That's how often do we choose relationships to fuel our ego? Like this person validates me. This person, thinks that I'm attractive. You know, what if we just chose connections because they were uplifting to us? It's like-minded people, and these connections are just authentic and sincere, and they make us feel uplifted and assist us in our goal, where we're going in life. Right. And therefore, the fear of rejection or not being lovable enough, it doesn't even apply, right? Because we're not in the business of making someone love us, right? Anyone ever try to do that too? Making someone love us. I can prove to you that I'm lovable. I can prove. I'll show you. I'll just keep trying. I'll just keep trying. Oh my gosh. That was like flashbacks of my 20s, right? But if God's the center of our life, we'll understand that genuine connection is required for self-growth and edification. And those are the relationships that we'll seek, right? We're not in the center. We're not trying to be in the center. We're not trying to prove anything. We're not trying to make ourselves lovable, and we're not trying to make somebody love us because we know that we are. We are by nature. That's what we are by nature because we're a part of God. And then instead of another example, instead of clinging to past mistakes, we can learn and move forward. We can learn from them and move forward. And again, if we know that we're here to grow and get closer to God, and that we're a spirit soul with a mind body vehicle, we understand that we're not our past behaviors or mistakes, right? Then we know that these obstacles are just merely that, right? Put in our way to help us grow closer to God. And it becomes easier to see them like that. We don't have to overly identify with the things of the past, the things that we did that we're ashamed of, right? Or we can let go of them. We can see, okay, that was a test and I did pretty good, or I really didn't do great on that one, but that's okay. I learned this, and the next time I'll be better prepared. And we can just move forward because that's all that they are. They don't mean anything about us. We get so stuck in the things that we did or the things that we didn't do, overly identifying with them. And then we're down like another rabbit hole. It's just like, let's just stay focused on where we're going, that relationship, and see everything else as just assisting us in getting there. And our whole life can be transformed. So that's what this verse is saying. And by overcoming these ego-driven emotions, we'll gain wisdom, inner peace, and ultimately the spiritual freedom and connection that we all seek, that we're all like longing for in this life, right? Okay. We can move on to 4:11. Does anybody want to share anything before we do? Oh, Katie, please share.
Thanks. Um, okay, so this made me think a bit about misplaced anger and like misplaced fear. And actually I woke up this morning out of like a bad dream where I was trying to remember what was going on in this dream. And but this doesn't matter too much, but like in the dream I was angry at my husband, but I realized that was not what's going on. Like I'm not angry at him, but I'm angry at my bosses, as you guys know I often am. And because we had sort of a change coming that we heard about yesterday that just made us feel even more like servants, not professionals. And so anyway, but also yesterday I was fortunate to go to Rukmini's class. She did the class at the DC Temple, and she was talking about how um when we put ourselves at the center, there's no virtue. And she had heard it from I forget who else, but it was interesting. And so I realized like when I get so angry, it's a clear indication that I'm putting myself at the center. Um, so yeah, it was just very helpful to think about like, I don't know all the information, so I'm making some assumptions. and I know myself and that I'm not very good at communicating sometimes. So I often then kind of like rage out later. And it can, and even if someone's like around me, they're just, I feel bad because they're like in experiencing it, even if it's not directed at them. So this is just such a good like check, like you're saying, it's a total check engine light. And it's just interesting because this example is like literally within the past, 17 hours. So I just thought I'd share that. It's very helpful to realize like I don't have to have all this fear and anger because it's coming from me putting myself at the center in an ego way, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes it's fun too, to when you're experiencing fear or anger, to try to backtrack that to what it is that you're actually afraid of. Like,
Mm.
what are you actually attached to? And then
Yes.
kind of play that out in your mind, right? Like, okay, what would happen if I didn't get, actually, I might not even care that much. Like, you can
Yeah.
backtrack it so much that you're like, this is silly.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, it made me think of, like, it did make me think, what is at that root? And it's like, well, I want love and respect from these people that clearly aren't doing that. And then I thought, like, why? I don't want why would I want love from a demon who hasn't yet been like helped by Krishna? Like what? I just had my birthday and I was feeling more loved than any other birthday. Like it was awesome. And so I'm like, why am I why and some of it has to do with, well, I'm not, my needs aren't being met, blah blah blah. But I can make better choices and move on and blah blah blah. But yeah, like why am I so focused on like fighting with these people when it's never going to work yet? Like there's hope for them later as there is for all, but you know
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, and a lot of times too, it's just like triggering of things that we have, like maybe you already feel like, like you're not accepted or you're not,
Yeah.
validated. Maybe that's just something you carry around. And
Yeah.
so if anybody doesn't do that to you, then it's triggering to you. But what we could do even instead of worrying about that so much is look for that validation from God because he'll give it to us. We don't understand that we don't have to search and, make these people love us or
Mm.
whatever it is, whatever hole you have in your heart from your, damaged childhood, which we all have. We all have these like, but look, we have a solution. This is the
Mm.
solution. Direct that towards God because he's really the only one that can fill us all up in that way, or we'll be forever searching and forever disappointed, like you said.
Mm.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Does anybody else want to share before we move on? Oh, Maria, please share.
Yeah, what if we didn't have a damaged childhood?
Ooh, you're lucky. You're so lucky.
I just don't remember any damage at all from childhood. But I'm sure there's still stuff there.
Well, it doesn't even have to be like somebody mistreated you. It could be like you misunderstood somebody's, intention, and then you're carrying that around with you, making it mean something about you that it doesn't. And it doesn't have to be some big dramatic thing. It could just be like a misguiding belief that, you have to achieve something to be worthy, or you have to earn your love, right? You have to earn being loved, or, so
But
you're not heard when you
I didn't
talk.
have any issues with anybody in childhood. I really didn't.
Well,
And
great.
I loved everybody and they loved me.
Well, that's wonderful because you're
But
you're in a good place to surrender to God.
but I've still had other issues in life as I
Yeah.
grew older and experienced different things.
Yeah, well, those things, those triggers, they can really just be distractions from us on our path because we'll stop and we'll try to, we'll get so caught up in it, or we'll follow it down like a rabbit hole of, because we'll be so caught up in our ego and making it mean something about us that it doesn't. So really, if you don't have those, if you don't have these things, then you can just go full steam ahead and you're not going to get tripped up. But chances are you've acquired some things as you've gone, as you've said, maybe you had a relationship after childhood or experiences. But regardless, if you're in this ego mindset, if you're in the center, you're going to get tripped up somehow, some way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Trevor, please share with us.
Few interesting topics stood out. The ego, it can be a confusing one because uh, a lot of people that are just coming up in self-realization talk about killing the ego and stuff like that, and it's like uh, what they mean is killing the false ego. They don't realize, like what you said, Radha, like, it's necessary to have it to maintain your individuality and whatnot. And God created infinite varieties through different forms. We're one of those forms. So we're specific flavors that he wanted to taste in his enjoyment. So in order to maintain the individuality, we have to have some sort of barrier that makes us all unique and whatnot. So, and I like how you put it also helps us find out what we are and what we're not and whatnot too. Um, and about balancing it out and whatnot. So, when it comes to the material ego, it's basically like a tether that grounds us on the planet that we're on and whatnot, and helps us to survive on that in that place. But it's a beautiful thing when you learn, like, it's not a bad thing. It's about harnessing it and using it in a good way, spiritualizing it, so to say. So then what Katie was talking about is everyone can relate to that, and what you were talking about as well about people triggering you, and it happens at work because you're forced to be around certain association that you might not prefer, and so it can be challenging. And if we're it is easier on certain days than it is others, but if we're able to see like the purification process through every circumstance, and you can tell that a lot of people are just getting whiplashed around by the Maya. Krishna's kind of just using them to help you purify. So if you've been triggered, it just means that there's healing that's taken effect. Don't take it personal. Just know that Krishna's creatively using what's around you to help pull those lower vibrations up out of the crevices of your soul, because they were hiding inside of you, and now whenever they're up in front where you can see it, that's in the light of your awareness, just means it's on its way out. So it's actually a really good thing that it's happening. And just have compassion for those people, because they're still so engulfed in that contamination, they don't even realize what they're doing. So I like how you put misplaced anger, misplaced this and that, because it's not labeling it as good or bad. And there's a lot of different examples of great devotees who have observed these emotions within themselves and were able to creatively utilize that energy in service to God. Hanuman is one of them. And you can use your anger in service in a protective manner, protect in the protection department of spiritual awareness. Anger is to be used and whatnot. But whenever, like Radha, you said it in a previous class, like it's whenever it controls you, whenever you're reacting because anger is in control over you, that's when it's a bad thing. But if you're able to harness it, then you can actually make some serious internal progress by using that strong energy to move forward. And Maria, about the childhood thing, it doesn't have, your triggers don't have to be from just this life. It could be from lifetimes ago, so even though we're good this time, doesn't we could be healing, and we're healing patterns from our entire bloodline by becoming devotees. It's a very bold and courageous, honorable decision to make, one of the most noble things you can do for everyone, not just yourself. So you're healing, we together are healing way more than the eyes can see. So triggers are a good thing. Triggers are a good thing. And the power of perception, when you're able to perceive these blessings and see the purification process through all of what's happening in your life, pleasant or unpleasant, that's when it begins to shift in your favor. And you can, like, then a deeper sense of gratitude is accessible for you.
Yeah, yeah, ultimately, if God is in the center of our lives, to the degree that we could take ourselves out of the center and put God in the center, everything will just become much easier and lighter. And we will be able to see how we can use everything in our lives in service and support of that relationship. And anger could be one of those things. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to, thank you so much, Trevor, for sharing that with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for receiving.
Cute. Let's move on to 411. This will be our last one for the day.
Wait till the end, buddy.
411.
Okay. As all surrender unto me, I reward them accordingly. Everyone follows my path in all respects, O son of Gita.
Okay. There's some really nice points from this one, right? This is one of the most important verses in the Gita, but it's also one of the most misunderstood verses. And we'll talk about why for both of those. So in the previous section, Krishna talked about his mission to establish Dharma and ultimately to develop prema, love for God. If you remember, we talked about that maybe in the last class, how Krishna comes, he has two missions. One is to establish Dharma, and the other is for people to love him, right? To develop love for God. So this may beg the question, Arjuna's now, it's kind of his internal question. It's what about people that don't comply, right? And he says, I include them. So this verse is kind of a demonstration of this reciprocity principle that all of us are so familiar with, like the law of karma. We receive according to the energy we put out, right? So if someone's always helping other people selflessly, then they'll naturally attract opportunities to serve and support and grow, right? Just like if a person approaches challenges with a positive mindset, they're more likely to find creative solutions. And so Krishna's saying here, the way that they approach me, I'll reward them accordingly. So he's saying here that he's not partial, right? Some people may be enriched in bhakti because they've done greater sacrifice, right? It's karma acting. As a person suffers, it becomes their own karma, right? So Krishna's not partial, he's reciprocal. And Prabhupada was once asked if he loves all of his disciples equally, and he says yes, but if someone comes forward to take responsibility, then I'll reciprocate. And I know many parents, there's many parents on this call. If there's a parent and a child, and a parent has multiple children, the parents may love all the children equally, will love all the children equally, but when a child approaches the parent, with like looking to learn, looking with love and respect and wanting to learn, the parent naturally reciprocates with guidance and support and encouragement, right? Even something as simple as just like if they ask for help with homework and they're expressing that affectionately and they listen with an open heart, then they'll receive, emotional warmth and helpful advice. But if a child resists the parent's guidance, right, if they're defiant or disrespectful, then the parent may reciprocate with some distance, or offer less support as the child is not ready to receive it. If a child refuses to follow the rules, the parent may give a consequence or stop offering help altogether, not out of malice, but just because they see that the child isn't open to the support being offered. And so this is how Krishna reciprocates with us, right? And how he reciprocates with different people will be discussed in future verses. But the takeaway for us is that the way that we connect with the divine or the universe shapes how we experience it. So this element of sincerity in our approach is key, right? This element of sincerity. So that's the first thing we get from this verse. The second thing, or another, I guess there's the second thing. Krishna in this verse, he says, everyone follows my path. Everyone follows my path. So if we consider a road on the way to Krishna, some may be going towards him and some may be going away. But still, they're all on the same journey of consciousness, where they're striving for some object of consciousness that will grant them supreme fulfillment. Right? So whatever they're doing, they're on the path. And Krishna offers people opportunities to come to him from wherever they are, right? We know that no one is disqualified. You can never be too sick to take the medicine, right? You can never be not good enough for this relationship. It's there for you wherever you are. Right? And whatever pace you want to go, right? He'll accommodate. He'll provide gradual pathways that are comfortable for you. And he even urges us, we read in 326, he even urges us not to be disturbed by instructions that are too advanced for us. Don't let that overwhelm you. And don't disturb other people. Everybody is coming to me at their own pace, at their own place. Let's approach this with grace. Right? He even accompanies us as the super soul in our hearts, so God in the heart, directing our journey in the material world. And he gives us the necessary resources to do that, all the while just waiting for us to come back to him. And so he's forever waiting, wanting, and working for us to come back to him. But we're all on this path towards Krishna. Okay, so now why is this verse one of the most misunderstood verses in the Gita? Krishna says that everyone is on his path. Sometimes people interpret this to mean that all paths lead to him, which isn't the same thing. Right? So when we talk about various spiritual paths, we can talk about like exclusivism. People that believe that they have like a monopoly on God, that like their path is the only path and no other paths lead there. This comes off to some people as like narrow-minded, or like if God is unlimited, why would he limit his access to one particular path? What if people haven't heard of this path? And then sometimes people may go to the other extreme, and then there's pluralism on the other extreme, where there's many paths and follow whatever path you want and it'll take you to God, right? And so if we take it literally, like every single path leads to God, then we have logical problems like, okay, does atheism lead to God? With whatever Arjuna does, he goes to Krishna, then why does it matter if he fights or not? If human agency becomes useless, right? Whatever humans do leads them to God. Okay, then what does it matter? What's even the point of the Gita or Arjuna's decision if all paths lead to the same place? So it doesn't really make sense either. So in between the two of pluralism and exclusivism is inclusivism, right? There may be many paths, but there has to be one purpose, right? So like consider a mountain and there's multiple paths up the mountain. Some paths, they just go halfway up the mountain. Or some paths, they'll just go around the bottom of the mountain, right? Like if you've ever been hiking, you go to a mountain, there's paths that you can take to the top of the mountain. There's paths that you can just kind of take a nice, you can circumambulate the mountain, or maybe just halfway. Maybe you just go to a nice little waterfall and you come back down, right? All of the paths that share the same purpose of going up the mountain are accepted, but paths that don't share that purpose are not accepted. Right? So the purpose is to love God, know God, obtain God. That's the top of the mountain. All paths that have that purpose will take you there. But the ones that don't are not accepted. So this is what the Gita teaches. The Gita is inclusive. Right? So then this could beg the question. So if there are many paths, do we really need to choose one and stick to it? Or will that make us closed-minded? Right? Some people have problems doing that. Like, I'm just going to take a little bit from lots of different paths, and I don't really want to commit to one. But if we don't commit ourselves to a path, we may never really appreciate any path. Right? So if we think about this mountain metaphor, the top of the mountain is spiritual consciousness. The bottom of the mountain is material consciousness, where we pursue material attachments. Various time-honored traditions are paths up this mountain, right? The last verse told us that all seekers are on the same journey to the one ultimate reality, right? So if we climb the mountain by any one path, we'll start perceiving things at higher realities, right? Then if we interact with others that have climbed the mountain by other paths, we can better understand their perceptions. I don't know if this has happened with any of you all since studying this, but like, I feel like studying this tradition, I understand Christianity so much better from studying this tradition. It's like when we start to elevate ourselves a little bit, we could relate a little bit better with, people that have elevated themselves a little bit, but by a different path. Right? So when we commit ourselves to a spiritual tradition, that tradition raises our consciousness to a higher non-material level. And then when we gain some spiritual experiences ourselves, we can appreciate other people's spiritual experiences. Right? So then if we study other traditions, we can better appreciate the universalities underlying all of them. But if we don't commit to any tradition, then we're just walking around the bottom of the mountain. We're walking in circles. And we can't really see anything from a higher perspective. Therefore, in order to really appreciate other spiritual traditions, we have to commit to one. We have to choose a path so that we can start to make progress, because that's the purpose of a path. It's whatever path you choose, stick to your path, because it's getting you somewhere. If you're just hanging around, taking in different, like cherry picking, you're not really elevating. You're not really making progress. That's the purpose of a path, right? So if we tie this back, we can also tie this back to 4:11, the last verse that we read, or 4:10, sorry, the last verse that we read, and the ego. If you have too strong or weak of an ego, it's going to be difficult to do this, right? If we have too strong of an ego, it makes people resist surrender because we think that we're in control, right? We think I'm the controller. I don't need God. I want things my way. But if we have too weak of an ego, we may have a lot of fear and self-doubt, right? We may even feel unworthy to take up the practice. We might think I'm worthless. God won't accept me. I'm not good enough to practice bhakti. Too strong or too weak of an ego is just opposite sides of the same coin, right? But regardless, you're putting yourself in the center, and that's a problem. The balanced ego comes when one understands that I'm God's eternal servant. God will take care of me. My real identity is beyond this material body. Right? When attachment, fear, and anger are removed, just like it said in the first verse, one naturally surrenders with love. So those are the points from 4:11. Does anybody want to share anything? Yes, Maria, please.
Yeah, I wanted to share that my first husband claimed to be an atheist, but he was never coming from ego. Even though he had a 140 IQ, was very, very bright, picked up on everything around him. He had some emotional damage, but he was coming from love and trying to support and care for other people. And I don't think that he could have done that if he wasn't in touch deeply and spiritually with God on some level. So I think a lot of times people who claim to be atheists aren't really. I have a feeling he might have been molested as a child by somebody in a position of authority because of the way he never, talked about it, but I just had that sense. But I think sometimes there's just emotional damage that causes people to not want to admit to certain things. I just had to put
Yeah,
it.
surely. And it doesn't mean that there won't be a time that he won't have a close relationship with God. But as long as that's not his goal, it's not going to happen. It's like we just learned, it's an austerity to develop this relationship with God. And if that's not someone's goal, then they're not going to be actively working towards it. And therefore, you may have some nice qualities. You may have compassion for humanity but ultimately you won't have that relationship with God. And there is a difference, but that doesn't mean that in his past life, maybe in past lives, he has had some kind of relationship with God and he had some experience that, brought that but he has some nice qualities. And, there's a whole different, everybody has different, blueprints of where they came from and how. But the verse is really just saying, whatever your goal is, if your goal in this life is to acquire as many material things as possible, you're not gonna attain God. It's not just something that happens. It's a relationship that we have to cultivate. And there's different ways of cultivating that relationship, but ultimately we have to make that our goal. Does that make sense? Yeah, maybe I lost her. Does that make sense, Maria?
I had remuted myself. Yeah, but he wasn't out to obtain material things. I mean, he could have easily, because his IQ, he was ahead of everyone else. My IQ is 130, but I was just impressed with how fast he would grasp everything around him and understand it. But he wasn't coming from competitiveness in any way. He so
Yeah.
he had to have a soul attachment with God. It's just that because of things emotionally that happened that he sort of didn't admit to it.
Yeah, and therefore maybe his progress was just kind of stunted in this life, and maybe he'll pick back up in
Yeah.
another time or place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, could be.
Thanks.
Could be. Trevor, do you want to share with us?
Yeah, I always like this quote. He's very Krishna in the Gita is very direct and blunt. I love the title as it is. You know, it doesn't give. It's to check the mind right off the bat before you read it. It's like gives it no wiggle room to play with the meanings. It's like it's on you. It's not safe. Sit down. Sorry. Um, all of them as they surrender unto me, I reward accordingly. Is basically explaining the basic science behind the love transactions that's occurring through every individual with God, whether it be unknowingly through the Maya, through people, through animals, whatever the case may be. It's explaining that basic love transaction that's occurring. And the impersonalists, they'll say the energy you give out, the universe will give back to you. It's the same way as saying that, you know, but with your personal relationship with God, you understand how the Maya functions and how the universe functions. As the universe is just as short for university. We're all here to learn about this relationship. And Prabhupada once had a question by a disciple that was related to this quote about, well, why does God discriminate? Why does he favor others, a little more? Why are you basically like, why are you so blessed? And why am I being treated differently? So that can be observed. That truth can be observed in this quote as well, as his response is always perfect and very authoritative and direct as well. But he is like, it's not God who discriminates, it's you who discriminates. It's all of us, because all he's doing is responding accordingly to all of our relationship. If we're making a sincere, it all breaks down to if you're making a sincere approach to God, and if you're how deeply surrendered and sincere you are, which surrender is a byproduct of your bhakti, your devotional service. Through devotional service, your heart is purified, your mind is purified, therefore your capacity opens up to a limitless position for giving and receiving love. that's when you're going to be reciprocated very heavily, and it's going to appear in the illusory situation that you're being blessed more so than others, so to say, in the eyes of people who haven't gone through that far enough to see that. There's another relative quote that talks about the same thing on, for those who are sincerely approaching me, I give them the knowledge in which they can understand me. Through love and devotion, they understand, the understanding of this relationship comes as a byproduct. It's part of Krishna's reciprocation. So I always liked that because it gives you incentive to keep driving forward and inward, and keep engaging in bhakti. And the more you do so, the more you're going to be able to give and receive love simply. So we all want to be better people. We all want to be better parents, better children, and so on. So the way we do that is through this relationship with Krishna. If you're loving God, who is everyone and everything, and if you're able to advance in that relationship, then you're naturally going to be able to give more to those around you, and you'll also be able to receive the abundance of the nature and whatnot on a deeper level. And also, I forgot to mention partially about what Katie was talking about earlier. A tip that helped me is, because we all experience it, we all experience moments where it's really hard to see the soul purification process through. So don't take me as a perfect being in any way. I've made the same mistakes so many times, but just simply these tips helped me. So to not expect things from others because they can't give what they do not have. And if they're reluctant to accept God, if they're not putting in the work, if they're not purifying themselves, they're not going to have any love to give. They're not going to be blessed with Krishna's grace. They're not going to have that understanding. So they're not even going to be able to receive the love that you're putting out. That's why it's so confusing for the devotee, because naturally we're so compassionate. You're like, well, I'm so caring and giving. Why is this person responding with such envy or hatred and arrogance? You know what I mean? It's like that's all they have right now, and we have to accept that because they don't have God yet. They haven't gone through the process yet. They're still running from the internal work and refusing it. So simply just not to expect things from others is a good way to create those boundaries and be happy in your own bubble, and your positive influence will have an effect even where you can't see it. We're naturally, as devotees, we're creating these higher vibrations. So we also have to take it into account that we're causing a healing just by being around other people who haven't gone through this process yet. So you might be triggering them just because they're in your auric field. You know what I mean? So it's a powerful thing. We're purifying more than just ourselves by engaging in this lifestyle. And yeah, that tip really helped me out. Stuff because people can't give what they don't have.
Thank you, Trevor.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mariah, do you want to share your realizations before we conclude for the day?
Everything was just so well put today, and everyone shared, a lot of what I would have to say so beautifully. Everyone put it so beautifully. The biggest thing that's coming up for me right now is just like, what this verse brings out for me, and like what even Maria was saying was like, it seemed like her husband, even though he identified as an atheist, seemed so in contact with something divine because he was so caring and he was so intelligent. He was receiving that intelligence from somewhere. And you touched on it too. He is probably picking up from a past life, and maybe in this life he wasn't as active in it. And finding his relationship with God, but he's still picking it up from a past life. Like, we all have a relationship with God. It's just to what degree we're covered or uncovered, and to what degree we are actively trying to continue to develop it, you know? And so, yeah, every single one of us, even the most horrific demoniac people, they still have some relationship with God. And that's a hard pill to swallow sometimes, because it's like, oh my God, they're so awful. But it's kind of like that quote, like, hate the sin, not the sinner, you know? And it's like, we don't know how covered we are. And we don't know, when we start to revive that bhakti, what level we're going to be at. Because even though maybe I could be extremely covered and look like I'm like not doing anything to develop my relationship with God, once I start, my soul could have been like 10 times more advanced than someone who was doing it this entire life, you know? So we never know where someone's soul is in that progression towards their relationship with God, because the body and the mind just covers it eventually, and might cover it more or less to a degree, depending on which life we're in, you know? So that's the biggest thing I just wanted to add. But everyone's shares was so beautiful, and I appreciate this class so much, and so many things that, like, with the ego, talking about the ego, it was so good. Just brings so much clarity, you know, seeing the difference between the ego and the balanced ego, or like the false ego and the balanced ego. It's a beautiful thing. And I agree with you in the beginning. You said sometimes you like try to have no ego and you're like have no self-worth or like confidence. Yeah, that was I feel that. I experienced that for too long in my life. But learning to find that balance again, it's beautiful. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing. That was so nice. Thank you. Thank you all for coming and sharing. Appreciate you all so much. And we'll see you on Thursday.
Hare Krishna.
Hey, Krishna.